you everyone for joining. Really thank you wherever you are in the world. I know we've got people joining from across the world. I'm delighted to be joined by Martin Kerr, who is going to take us through all the information about ISO 55001 to 2024. But before I just hand over to Martin, I just wanted to let people know how we're going to handle questions. We've got a lot of people who've registered for the webinar, so we felt a good way to do the questions will be through Slido. So it's slido.com. I've put it in the chat, and I'll put the code up again, but it's 4665666, which is the Slido code. Please pop your questions in there, and you've got the opportunity to vote up questions as well. So we'll get, when we get to the questions part, Martin will be able to answer the most popular questions.
I hope.
Martin's very kindly joined us. I think you're in Australia at the moment, Martin.
I am indeed, just down in Sydney, Australia. Yes.
Yeah, I know you do a lot of travelling, so I was just checking where you were in the world. But anyway, I'm delighted that Martin's been able to join us. Obviously, it's his early evening, but we've got people joining us from across the world. Just so you're aware, we are recording the session, so if there's anything you want to go back to, you'll be able to see the session again. And also, Martin's very kindly agreed to give us a copy of his slides, and we'll PDF those, and we'll make those available in the same place as the recording. So thank you for that, Martin. So I'm going to hand over to Martin now. We will be doing questions a bit later, so please do remember to pop your questions into Slido, and I'll catch up with you a bit later on when we're in the questions session. Thank you.
Look, thank you so much, Ursula. Great to see you again. And again, it's a real privilege to share some of the insights that I was witness to and, of course, managed throughout my life as convener of ISO 55001. I originally joined the ISO committee in 2017. And in 2021, when we kicked off in May, I was quite privileged to be able to lead a group of great people throughout the journey, if you like, over this 3 years. Today, I'm going to walk you through a bit of background, some of the insights, some of the things you may or may not know about an international standard. I don't want to make this a super dry topic. I'm not going to dive straight into detail. So the first part will just be setting the scene, giving you some insights. Then I'm going to talk I've got a slide for the high level changes for ISO, and then I'm going to delve into pretty much a slide per section into that detail. As Ursula said before, I will be sharing this back with the IAM afterwards. And again, looking forward to seeing what questions we may get from the panel themselves. So TC251, it's called a technical committee. Up until 2014, it was a PC, which stands for a project committee. When the ISO was first launched in early 2014, it then became a technical committee supporting it. As you can see there in the structure, I know you've got Tom Goodyear and Budwin addressing a webinar next week, and we'll talk more broadly around this. And I know you've got Shiv talking about data at a point in time as well. But as you can see across the bottom line there are different what we call working groups. I have had the privilege and sometimes pleasure, sometimes not, working across different ones, but it really enabled me as convener of O1 to have a balanced view about what we're setting out to do. And I'll share with you some of those insights again and the guiding principles that we undertook. I do want to just reach out and thank two people in particular over the last 3 years. One of them is Dick Hortensius. So Dick, I would say very much my 2IC throughout the life of the O1 project. He's also on the JTCG, which looks at the structure of this standard and all the management system standards around the world, and he was just a great help. I'd also like to acknowledge Anne-Marie Kin. She started off as a 2IC, if you like, for O1, but then she really stepped up to a huge role, and some of you I know in the IAM who attended TC251 will know that some of the challenges that she undertook, and of course got there at the end. I'd also like to thank the theme leads and the sub-themes, and I'll share more detail about what that actually means. But to give you an idea of across 3 years, we had over 100 meetings in various time zones with various people and various topics. And it was a big undertaking. I've got a very supporting family, and I know that those who led these teams, and you know some of them as well, including the likes of John and Neville, etc. Just setting the scene, when we undertake any ISO meeting, it's quite strict in terms of the code of conduct. I'm not going to read this out, but it's very much around, we are here for the betterment of the standard itself. Self-interest is not welcome, but of course it can be a welcome challenge sometimes when you're trying to get a point across. We need to actually align with the other management system standards in terms of what they call the harmonized structure. I'll get to that momentarily. But as you can see, at the end of the day, it is a strict process. It is an interesting organization, having everyone is a volunteer, but at the end of the day, we are providing a product for the globe in terms of the management system for asset management, or an AMS. The project timeline, and this is another interesting thing and quite rigorous in ISO. The maximum term that you can spend reviewing and revising a standard really is 3 years. Now, a bit of insight, the standard originally was, the first version went out in 2014. The reason why, and typically every 5 years there is a review cycle for an international standard, especially in MSS. And it wasn't due to COVID, it was actually due to the delay in the start of the review of 55001, was due to what was referred to as the high-level structure of ISO, moving to what they call harmonized structure. And I'll get into the detail of that at the latter part of this pack. But that aside, we had a starting point in May of 2021. And from that point, we actually went through those 3 years. As you can see, just some screenshots here. We were always looking at the vertical line. Where were we? At sometimes we felt as a group, and that's across all working groups, we'll never get this done. There's too much work to do. There's conflicting. But what we did find that worked for us was, in the time of COVID and working virtually, in some respects, we got a lot of work done at a shorter amount of time. But as we learned when we got to the end of the process and the final 2 face-to-face meetings, it's really when the conversation comes to light and you can really challenge some of those norms. In any standard that's undertaken by ISO, it's recommended that you come up with what's called a design spec, or a design specification. What that looks at is, as the name suggests, you're going from 2014 to 2024 as a version. But what does that actually mean? There are certain constraints in terms of the editorial and the structure of a management system standard, but we also had to accommodate some of the ideas that came through Amersfoort, which is in the Netherlands in 2018, Nanjing in China from 2019, and then Peru in 2019. So all these face-to-face meetings led to the ingredients, if you like, for some of the ideas. But what I wanted to do in this case was understanding, especially when we're in the middle of COVID, I really wanted to put out there a team charter, and the team charter was agreed, and it evolved over a few different versions. And I think it actually set the scene for how we work together. Because across those 3 years, we really went through a creation phase, a collaborative phase, and then finally a consensus phase. And my biggest learning out of leading as convener is, if you start with consensus, people won't come with you on the journey. You do need to allow ideas to be fleshed out and how they make their way in. So again, what you're looking at there is simply that, the design specification that was signed off and agreed with TC251, and of course the charter in which Workgroup 6 developed. What you're looking at here, left to right, are all the inputs, if you like, to the consideration for 01, but also the consideration for 00. It's fair to say that 00 is, of course, the umbrella artifact that sits across all the standards. It's very much the why are we doing this, versus the 01 is the structure, the assurance of how you will actually go, or what you put in place to do that in terms of that decision making. But as you can see down the left-hand side, there were pre-existing registers of ideas, In the ISO committee, we have a thing called a NWIP or a PIP, which is Proposed Improvement Program or Project. That is actually led under the guise of Working Group 4, which is also the working group that managed the OO review and revision. Down the left-hand side, you can see AHG, which is ad hoc working groups. We had one on value years ago. Of course, John Woodhouse, as you know, he was part of that. And that also was run in conjunction with Anne-Marie Kin. We also had some working groups around information and data. Naval Shaddy, who you know, was a big part of that as well. So as you can see, when you got all those inputs coming through, we had to work out how do we actually capture the good ideas that surrounded the asset management system, but put some sort of structure around it so we didn't end up with people appearing to be in their pet projects, but we actually had to make it move forward from just the themes into, of course, the final structure of O1. So that's really a pictorial of what that looked like in terms of ideas through to themes. In those themes, back in the day, we actually had, most people were volunteers. There weren't many people that had to be voluntold. But as you can see down the left-hand side there, value and decision making, John led that one. Risk, we had Matthias from Sweden and Tom Carpenter from Australia. The risk was an interesting one, given that the standard structure harmonized structure had changed the way the management system was laid out. But also Tom, and fortunately, Dick Hortensius, who was my 2IC, they were also in TC262. So they were actually able to bring to life some of the conversations that were happening in parallel. Another thing I just remembered now, that in TC251, there are approximately 30 to 35 liaison technical committees that either have a seat at the table to understand what we're doing in asset management, but we also, as TC251, have a seat at the table to see what other management systems are doing, and in particular, risk, information security, and even 45,000 safety, etc., etc. Life cycle management was a key one. We realized that a lot of the insights that the team brought in, especially the theme leads, was very much around, it's one thing to talk about asset management, it's another thing to talk about value, but it's also another thing for people to understand what life cycle management actually means, not just life cycle costing. So Bob from the USA had that one. The strategic asset management plan, well, it still is, but predominantly that was an appendix in 55,002. It was seen as very important to bring that into the mix, into the standard, and not just mention it, but you'll see this this morning, there is a subsection dedicated to the SAMP itself. Kerr from the USA led that in and around maternity leave. Knowledge and information management was a key component. Naval led that up. And in conjunction with probably Shiv later on in Working Group 13, which looks at data in its own right, this was a key one, and it created a lot of discussion, as those who were part of TC251 will remember. And then finally, leadership and people. Lafreya from Abramam and Brazil, he was very much the lead on that one. And what we realized in looking at the section around leadership, because remember, you got leadership as what's now a principle, you got leadership as a section. How do we bring it to life so it's not just a black and white process? It is something that means something to an organization. So we were trying to sometimes influence organizations to adopt asset management, but then we also realized leadership section isn't the place to do it. An organization will or won't accept asset management as a philosophy and as a way forward. So a lot of discussions around that. Moving on then, when we had the themes, and this all looks very techie on the screen, but one of the things I suppose I'm most proud of with the team and as convener, every single change, every single idea, every single risk and opportunity can be traced back to May of 2021. There's over 1,000 comments. What you're looking at here, we looked at the themes, the 7 themes I just went through before, but how they actually correlated back to the harmonized structure. And by doing that, we're actually able to then take comments, ideas, working items, etc., and then allocate them appropriately to these sub-teams. The sub-teams then went from the themes, and then they moved into the different sections of O1, which is, I'm sure many of you would realize, sections 1 through to 10. Sections 4 to 10 are the most focused on, but 1, 2, and 3 also play bearing. So the risk and opportunity register was always there. That was very handy, especially when we moved in and started working in parallel between OO and O1. And again, it's a challenge because OO is very much open system thinking, new concepts, moving from fundamentals through to principles and objectives. But what that also meant was whatever OO came up with, sometimes that would actually put a determination around how O1 managed something in the first instance. But then once we landed on something between OO and O1, we also had to look across the other working groups to make sure either we weren't overstating something, we weren't understating something, and each individual technical specification or standard still had relevance in its own right. Now, some of the changes, again, as Ursula said, I'm going to share this with the IAM. You can look at it yourselves. But a key thing, as I said before, due to the harmonized structure changing from HLS, which is high-level structure, to the harmonized structure, there were some subtleties. And in those subtleties meant that we come up with the concept, well, you've got 1 down to 10, and then you've got the subsections. And if you laid all 60 plus management system standards across the board, say since 2019, they all have identical sections and subsections, which is good from an integrated management system point of view. But what it also meant was there were certain rules that we had to apply, and there were certain ways in which you would go back to ISO if you wanted to challenge any of what we call the structure. So that's the first one, the structure. For the most part, we were fine with that. There was a couple of hiccups between us and the risk committee in terms of TC 262, but that was resolved only within the last year, 2023 we did. What you're looking at is a sample. This is back in 2022, late 2022. I just wanted for those who are joining the call today to understand when you're looking at a management system standard, we refer to the concept of blue text versus black text. Blue text is the text that fits part of the structure of the harmonized structure, and it is what we call reserved. You can add to it, but you can't remove from it unless you go up to the program manager of management system standards in ISO and have a challenging discussion. The idea obviously is the more consistent that management system standards are across the world, when you lay them out across each other, integration becomes easier, but also too, it makes everything then more relevant when you get down into requirements, or as we often refer to them as the shall statements, they start to stack up. I'm not going to read it out, but you can see under 4.1, the organisation shall determine, etc., etc. Well, that would be the same in a quality management system, safety management system, etc. But what we've done here is through the group, and I don't even know if that's the final text there, it probably isn't, probably some subtle differences, we can actually add things in there. But as you'll see in the guiding principles, adding things to the standard at one stage, we went from a number of requirements in 2014, we went all the way up, and then we started to whittle our way back down to what we believed was an acceptable and relevant set of requirements for remembering a management system standard for asset management. Another view of the world is just another example here, intended results versus intended outcome. Some of the subtleties around that wording was when we had a lot of discussions, or Working Group 4 did, very much around value, definitions of value, and what does that mean in the context of decision making, but also from the SAMP going down through the organisation, but also to across the life cycle of an asset. Right, the guiding principles. Apart from our team charter, which really did serve us quite well, we came up with, actually it was the first 5 guiding principles. They were pretty easy to come up with. Less is more. As was mentioned before, it's so easy just to keep adding stuff on. And I remember at the face-to-face meeting in Philadelphia in 2023, there was a little, I won't say tension, but there was a lot more challenge. If we've got a phrase or a requirement in one section, is that really repeating it in another section? And that was the first time at that meeting that we had what I would say is we had a good balance between auditors, asset managers, and of course a business lens over it. We also wanted to consider organisations that were new to 55,000. We didn't want to scare them away and say, here's the new one. And also organisations that were already certified. What is the delta from going from one to another? And again, I'm hopeful and confident, relatively confident, that some of what I'm going to show you this morning or this evening, wherever you are, will assist you in that. We also wanted to consider an auditor. Some of the things that we felt going in about the midpoint, 18 months in, was a lot of the requirements were very much descriptive as opposed to prescriptive. We really had the opportunity, we had a few system auditors in the mix. And I even remember as late as in January, I know there's a couple on the call today from parts of the world, I think a couple from the States actually, they were actually able to put the lens of an auditor on it and say, well, I don't know how I would audit that objectively. But we also had the Portuguese in Rio in January of this year, and it was really good. They said, oh, there's too many requirements. But once we actually played out where we came from the themes, how it worked into HS, and how we actually expressed it to the sense that it was a requirement of the management system standard, but sometimes the requirement was just to demonstrate that you'd considered it, not so much that you had to have it in there. So we were very mindful that we're taking people on a journey. The outcome worded, not detailed, as I've already touched on. And this is number 6 was a key one. We got a bit tense at certain times when we reminded people the asset management system standard 55,001 is not how to do asset management. It is a management system standard for how you translate organizational objectives into actionable plans in the context of asset management. You know, you've got your anatomy, you've got the global forum, all these different societies have got their own ways of doing it, but this was strictly an MSS, and that we had some challenging conversations, and which is very much G7, not how to do asset management. The last one was very important, and it was our final test, and that was, if I'm a small mum and dad organization, is this standard too much for me to implement? Is it only for top tier organizations? And that, I'm pleased to say, when we went back over, especially in probably the last 6 to 9 months of the standard, we were able to say, does it address all of these 8? If it did, we'd move on. If we felt there was a little bit of doubt on a few of them, we'd actually have a little bit of a scrum and work out, you know what, let's take this back to a sub-working group and actually see if we can make that a bit better. Almost to the detail now. So this is a bit of the background, and just to give you an idea of how much momentum there was at the end of last year to, of course, January 26, which was the day the plenary in Rio endorsed the standard to go forward. And I remember, because it was also Australia Day, you can just see how many meetings that were there leading up to that. Any meeting with Work Group 4 was 00, Work Group 6, 01, and of course Work Group 3, who we'll hear a lot more from next week with Budwin and Tom as well. I'm going to start off with the high level changes now and then get into a level of detail. I might go to about the 35-minute mark. I'll make it as succinct as I can. From sections 4 down to sections 10, which most of you will be more interested in. Decision making and value, that's new, section 4.5, and that was very much led from John Woodhouse from the outset, and of course even as far back as probably a year prior to that. Section 6.1, when we talk about risk and opportunity, it used to be one section. It has been separated out. We really wanted to emphasize, and so did Matthias and Tom, the leaders of that area, that risk can also be a positive risk or reverse risk, if you like. So risk and opportunity separated. When we talk about the next one is the asset management plan, it moves out from just being a mention up the top of the standard to being its own subsection. So 6.2.1 is now that SAMP. And of course, that took on its own debate because Kerr did a great job by getting it to a certain point of importance. But then we started to say, well, there's a lot of duplication in here. How do we make it more objective? Asset management objectives was revised very much because the fact that the SAMP was sitting above it, it was easy to actually articulate the asset management objectives, how to achieve those, 6.2.3, and then of course we're into the data, information and knowledge. Now in some respects data and information didn't change a lot, but it's still new in the terms of the discussions that we had and more of its intent. And that very much came on the back of a typical management system standard that talked about documented information. Okay, that's common. We'd probably all know that from whether it's ISO, whether it's 9001, 45,000, whatever, same thing. Operational planning and control, or it used to be under operation, we've also including lifecycle management. We wanted to get that wording in there and really draw out the fact that it's not just around operations. And I know this is those that are familiar with management system standards. We often talk about, say, QA and QC, and for 9001 is a nice fit into Section 8, but we really wanted to draw it out. It's not just about insourcing, outsourcing, etc. It is very much around the life cycle. Externally provided processes, we wanted products, technologies, and services, because it's not just contingent labor that an organization considers. In the world we're in now, when you're talking about IoT, you're talking about BIM, you're talking about a lot of different things. How we actually procure services has changed dramatically in the last decade. Management review was revised, and probably, I was in this discussion quite a few times, predictive action. So I'm going to go, they're the high level changes. I'm going to delve straight in now, just go into a little bit more detail without, well, you're not going to go to sleep, I hope, at that time of the morning for most of you. First section, section 1, scope. We actually had to include, due to the harmonized structure, some elements in there. But as you can see here, more thought around the realized value from assets through their life for both the organization and the stakeholders. It's not just about, for the external stakeholders, an organization also has to be sustainable in its asset portfolio. You can see here the achievement of asset management objectives and applicable requirements. Sometimes they can be different, especially if you're looking at legislative requirements, etc. And of course, continual improvement of asset management, the asset management system, and performance of assets. The team was very strong about separating those three. You have assets, you have the discipline of asset management, and you also have the asset management system. In terms of the next sections, normative references, obviously we're going to now look back up to 55,000, 2024. Terms and definitions, I know a few people, I know Tim, one of my mates from the IAM, had a long discussion one day regarding the word incident, how it means different things in different parts of the world. Preventive action was also introduced, because it's not just, preventive action previously and corrective action went hand in hand. You had a preventive action, corrective. Preventive in the context of that space now fits under corrective. And it really confused a few people. Maybe that'll go away, but at the beginning it created a lot of, I think, tension between the traditional management system or systemic issues versus this latest one here, predictive action, which is when you're looking beyond just today, what might you do differently to influence the future? And that also tied back up into the decision-making framework and the decision-making criteria that sits within 4.5. Definitions of value. I could smile, I could cry. That was a long discussion, and those who were involved from the IM will remember some of those colourful conversations we had regarding that. Section 4, moving on to the context of the organisation, which is very much the why. The two key points here is the harmonised structure, of course, front and centre. We also had to make sure that in Section 4 we referred to considerations of climatic change and how that impacts. That only came in December. We were notified in December 23. It's not a big deal, but we had to put it into 2 sections. So rather than just being a distant requirement that you may consider, it's part of this international standard. The organisation shall determine which identified stakeholder requirements will be addressed in the asset management system. Previous to that, it was assumed, sometimes implied, that all stakeholder requirements would be in the AMS, not necessarily. Same can be said for a safety management system for that respect. Also too, shall determine the impacts of asset and asset management activities on stakeholders. Some of that discussion came up through some of the team members that came from a mining background. A small world we live in, but we know there's been some decisions that have been made more at the coalface around the physical assets that have actually impacted stakeholders, and of course, whether that's Indigenous art all the way through to even impacts on maybe a dam breaking above a village, etc., etc. No changes in terms of the scope of the asset management system. That's pretty much the same. The asset management system, as you can see, the former SAMP is now not just mentioned up there in 4.4, it's now got its own section in 6.2.1, and asset management decision making is the biggest one. And there was a lot of discussion around that. And at the end of the day, I think we were pleased, and I was pleased where that ended up. It was probably very much to remind, again, senior stakeholders of an organisation, there's decision making that cuts down through the vertical of the organisation, so from your SAMP to your AMP, but there's also decision making that goes across the organisation by way of life cycle. Leadership, whilst we, Lafreya, myself and Ross and a few others were very keen to not use adjectives in a standard, but strengthen what the intent and the requirements were, there wasn't a lot of changes at the end of the day. We really just landed on the fact that if an organisation really wants to do asset management and do it well, they'll choose to do it, but they'll always be the organisation that will do it more aimed around compliance. Section 6, another level of detail, as I already mentioned, you've got the risk and opportunity being separated out. And I think that's really important. We had some finance representatives in the working groups as well. And even if you think of a waterfall diagram, money going up, money going down, opportunity, decision-making, all those sorts of things, I think this is very healthy, that risk isn't only looked at in terms of the negative, because when you look at the opportunities, you're also then linking down into the areas such as 10.3, which is, of course, predictive action. Planning itself, as you can see, SAMP made its way in there. And what we've actually, one of the last things we did in Rio this year was when we did the final design, a design spec for 55,002, which of course we really want to come after 55,001. We looked at the concept, does it need to be an appendix in 55,002 anymore, or can it just be in its own subsection in 01? That'll be up to the technical committee to decide that. But I think it's fair to say is depending on where you are around the world, how you actually do or create and consider an asset management plan or a strategic asset management plan does vary, but I'll keep my own views to myself. But again, that was a key point. Harmonized structures, you can see there. A key one I thought was really interesting. 6.3 in the harmonized structure talks about planning for change. So we know change management or the management of change is down in section 8, but that always seemed to be orphaned because of course you've got then, well, you might be knowing you've got to move from point A to point B, but how do you actually plan for that? So that's why that's very much up around that planning section. So planning for change, top down, but the management of change, bottom up. Number 7, again, support. And again, planning and support are the biggest sections in any management system standard. Competency, there we talked about more around the periodical competency assessments, as opposed to saying, yep, we've got a competency management framework or system, putting some more rigor around the fact that it should be cyclic or periodic in some way, shape or form. Awareness, that was a lot of discussion regarding linking back to the leadership piece, but it was accepted that there wouldn't be many changes. We were trying to, at some stage, to give you some insight from an awareness point of view. You could just go back and default to say, oh, there's a poster on the wall that says, yep, we've got our asset management policy. But there was never really any measure of how effective that actually was. So there's been a lot of talk coming out of the 2024 series about what could possibly change. Communications, as you can see there, are related to, of course, stakeholder consultation on their needs. So rather than just assuming your stakeholders will want this particular information, there's more emphasis to say, well, what information are you seeking? Because if you think about a management system typically is plan, do, check and act. The check and act needs to be there. So that was a key component. Documented information, again, no substantial changes there, but of course that was very much a big discussion within O1, but also within the data working group 9, which is the data and information piece that Shiv eventually led. So that was a key piece. Nava was a key component of that too and ran that sub-team for at least 2 years. So there was a lot of work and effort put into that. Knowledge was very important too, because it's not just around data and information. You might think of data as a record or a transaction. Knowledge is data placed into a domain to support decisions, but we also wanted to draw out that tacit knowledge from an individual or a group of people in an organization was equally important. We all know too, when we talk about the knowledge management, experience and insight, that is really part of the value that an organization has at its own disposal. So that was very much the key discussions there. Section 8, as I said before, lifecycle management was a key component. I know with Bob leading that subgroup, we got into a lot of detail. We were looking around, there's, 15288 systems engineering has a view on lifecycle. The 16,000 series has a view. Industry has a view, but we really lifted it up and kept it simple, that really the intent of getting leaders in an organization to appreciate it. I think we hit the mark. But of course, you don't want to go past the point of you don't want to go past the point of a requirement and start prescribing. That's left to more of a technical specification in ISO, or again, something that even the IAM would put out. Control of change I've mentioned on, no changes there. And the term outsourcing, as you can see, changed to, of course, processes, products, technologies, and services, because that also supported the changes to the harmonized structure from the JTCG. Performance evaluation, no major changes there. And that's not to say it's not important and we didn't test that. We talked a lot about lead indicators, lag indicators, but as you saw up further in the standard, we talked about performance of assets, performance of asset management as a discipline, but also performance of an asset management system. All three are obviously interrelated, but this is very much around the system itself. Almost there, everyone. Continuous improvement, as you can see there, not a lot of change there, but non-conformity and corrective action, you can see preventive actions are now explicitly included or implied within a corrective action. That got my head a little bit out of whack when I first was trying to grapple with that. And I think to some extent, that's why predictive action came about. Because whereas a preventive action is something that you don't want to reoccur again of a negative consequence in a management system, predictive action was what you might do either from the assets point of view, from the asset management point of view, or from the asset management system. Now, there was at one stage a bit of bias coming from a few people, including myself, that from that reliability background. But what we did do at the end of Philadelphia in May of 2023, and then finally in January of 2024 in Rio, we made sure we all went back and did a full clause by clause, section by section stress test on it. We played that back to OO group. So OO group got to read O1, we read OO, and then we came together to finally endorse, if you like, approve, of course, the consensus that is now OO and O1. So look, that's where I'm going to get to today. I said to Ursula I'd aim about 30 minutes, and as my wife says, I do talk over the line sometimes, but I just wanted to be able to open it up now to any questions that you may have. I've gone into a bit of detail, given you a bit of background, but I'll open the door for any of you who wish to put forward a question. Ursula.
Martin, well, we've got plenty of questions, so thank you for going through that. We've just popped up the questions here, so people will be able to see the most popular ones. I think the top of the shop, which won't surprise you, Martin, is what timescale is working with O2, which is obviously the guidance document, to align with O1.
Okay, so that first question there, O2. So what we did in the last 2 days in person in January, we stripped back the design spec or we put forward a design spec for O2 and we went back to first principles in ISO, and that is an O2 document should be a guidance on how to do O1. Now, being present in 2018 in Amersfoort in the Netherlands, it was acknowledged that there was both an asset management system guidance perspective, but also a topic guidance, value, decision making, etc. What I think you'll find in 2024 is a lot of that content will come back out. It will be very much O1 biased, and then just let the societies do that. Next question, what is the impact to existing AMS accreditation against 14? Is there a requirement to comply? What is a certain time frame? What you'll find is, depending on your standards body in your country, so BSI will have their own view of it. I was recently representing Standards Australia. What I believe in Standards Australia, MB19, they'll look at a phasing approach. From memory, I think it's up to 3 years, but I think it's also fair to note that an organisation may elect to say that we don't wish to go to this new standard, we wish to stay to the current one. So that's an option. What are the material changes to the standard that accredited organisations need to look at? I think the material changes really the ones I went through, but I would suggest decision making is a key one. The SAMP being brought out more as a vehicle for translating requirements is another one. Risk versus opportunity, they're the big ones. The others I think are more subtle. Now, I'm not going to quote the number of how many requirements there was to now, because the first time it was ever done, it was done on shall statements. Then it was done another time on bullet points within the shall statements. And then there was a version that said, what's a real requirement? So I think what I've just said then and from this slide deck, I would suggest that would be a starting point. But again, we really did test it on an auditor, an asset owner, a lot of consultants, and we feel we got that right balance. There's a lot of change about the life cycle management in this review. I would say that it's been brought out to make sense to the leadership, the C-suite and the E-suite in a typical organisation. When they hear the words life cycle, I think they glaze over. They think, oh, this is all maintenance and technical stuff, where really life cycle is a great basis for where you start at the beginning with the why and you go all the way down through to O&M and then renew and dispose. So that was the intent. The relationship between O1 and 15288, 2023, and software engineering, we did, of course, we know that asset management, the backbone of it in terms of decision making is all around demand, requirement, spec, design, solution. That was not lost. It's still referred to there, and I know that 15288 and some of the work I know that Ursula's been doing in the background with INCOSI, for instance, is trying to draw out what does that mean in layman's terms as opposed to a management system. So that continues, I know. During the IMA conference, it was discussed that there would be a handover period where the business will have to certify. That's very much, at the moment, wet finger in the air, probably a 3-year horizon. I don't know, even we're all friends in this. I'm in the Asset Management Council. We're also looking at what does that mean for our members, and I'm sure the same will apply there in the IAM. Why does OO no longer have a diagram showing the AMS? Is there a reason for its removal? I'll answer that another way. One thing I learned in ISO was if something is obvious, it doesn't need a definition. And I think some of those diagrams did support a point of reference at the beginning. And I know that in different parts of the world have moved forward in different rates in asset management. But I think if something can be understood through the text, it's a lot better than trying to actually have it as a diagram, because we've all got a left hand and right hand side of the brain. Why is 6.3 planning of changes and change management top down versus the change management bottom up? The way I'd explain that is planning for changes is really understanding why and what you will actually do in terms of changing your organization. The management of change is very much the bottom up, is what and sort of when and how you'll actually do it. I think it was a very good inclusion. And remember, this didn't come from just TC251. This came from the top 20 management system standards and 2 representatives from each to arrive at that point. What is your view of the benefits for an individual getting involved with the development of standards? Look, I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about this process. I learned a lot of things I did not know. I've come out of it with a great network of, I like to call friends from all around the world. I think if you're going to get into it, I would encourage it. Be prepared to listen. And I think empathy is probably your best situation. If you're talking about asset management, as long as you can differentiate between assets, asset management as a discipline, and a management system standard, you'll enjoy yourself. What is 55011? 55011 is the public standard on decision making. For a short time, I convened that, and at the beginning, it kind of lost its way a bit, but it's now gone from being a standard more to a guidance or a technical spec. I forget which one it's going to be, but what it sets out to do is really help a government in particular, or if I think it could even serve a not-for-profit or an NGO, actually understand how to adopt the philosophy of asset management. How did the development of 55013 impact the development of 01? We did go back and forth a couple of times, and I think when 13 first came out as a concept, it was looking at data as an asset, but then it kind of shifted a bit and went, well, data supporting asset management decision making. And I really thank Shiv from the United States, who was very much, we used to invite him into our discussions to make sure there was an alignment that way, but we weren't at mixed odds with what we were setting out to do. And I think we've mostly achieved that. Why continue with clause 10.2, preventive action, which is no longer present in other ISO standards? Preventive action, as opposed to predictive action, preventive action really sits in under corrective, and you will find that because it's part of the standard annex here, it's going to make its way into the other 60 plus management system standards. It's a bit of a reset for people as old as me who remember ISO 9001 so well. And again, that was very much why the bias for 10.3 predictive action came to be. Can anyone participate in 251? You are best to go through an organisation that is already identified within TC 251. That is not to say a not-for-profit or an industry community out there can't register to join, absolutely, but an individual just can't rock up to an event. For instance, whilst I was in Standards Australia, I was the member representative from the Asset Management Council of Australia. They were only allowed to put in one member. What are all the requirements added in 2024 to maintain existing? Well, again, a lot of that came from what I went through this morning. You will have to look at it in the context of your organisation to see, is it just really looking at it through a different lens, or is it a substantial change? I know myself, having helped organisations through accreditation, the first one is often the easiest one. The second one, surveillance, is, oh yeah, a few minors, but once you get past that, you really have to understand, one, why you did it, and what does it mean for your organisation. Companies already have achieved accreditation. I think that's similar. Companies that have already achieved their certification, do they need to take actions to adhere? Well, again, that comes from the phasing. I'm assuming BSI, like Standards Australia, will vote this in, and then there'll be a transitional period to do just that. Did they consider indicative templates for the SAMP and AMP? Oh, that's a good one. I'll only speak to the society that I represent. We removed them at one point because people thought that the word template was the final completion. And we all know that if you're a small organisation or a larger organisation, how you articulate organisational objectives down to asset management objectives, you might be able to do them in 2 pages, although many of us have seen people take 500 pages to do it. So that's probably why it's not a good idea to use indicative templates. SAMP and AMP document, okay. Whether I am certificate and diploma exam, I can't really answer that one, I'm sorry. What is the current status of the other 55,000 series? You'll just have to tune in with Thomas Goodyear next week with Budwin, because they actually have got the timelines. Budwin's got a greater sense of humour than I, and he can speak to all those other the other standards. Why 55,011 and then not 3, 4, and 5? I think you'll find that 4 was always reserved, like it got 9,004. The numbers obviously just start at 10. It's just a naming convention from within the ISO. Latest version of O1 seems to imply substantially more administrative requirements and more shall statements. Was this necessary? My gosh, my first principle, or the first principle, less is more. You will not believe the amount of late nights, the amount of debate, the amount of red wine I consumed over a 3-year period. I believe we met a consensus that was a sensible amount. But when you bring in things like decision making, you bring in things like predictive action that are very sort of outward thinking and open thinking, it's hard to actually cement that back to quantitative shall and requirements. Again, I'm pleased and proud of the team for getting where we did get to, but of course that was also done in conjunction with OO. Can you throw a light? Is there a telco where 55001 implemented, and what will they change with the newer version? Actually, a telco is something that I don't really have personal experience with. Other utilities I do, but again, you need to ask the question, did they do it out of compliance or did they do it out of value? Because that would also be the starting point for your consideration of how you would actually approach that either new certification or recertification.
Martin, sorry to interrupt, but I think it might be worthwhile, whoever's asked that question, because it's anonymous, so I can't tell, but it might be worthwhile you having a look on the TC251 page, because there is a list of known organizations that have got ISO 55000 certifications. It's not necessarily that the TC251 committee acknowledged that we might not have captured everyone, but you can submit in if you've got that, and it is there, so it is worthwhile having a look.
No, that's a good point. I remember working with Budwin and John Woodhouse. We came up with the KCO, which was that list. But the other thing to note that is different standards bodies publish them. Some do, some don't. So it was always a matter of going out and looking at Google News to find out who was. But that's a good reminder. Thank you, Ursula. We share the draft under discussion version. I think you're asking, can the draft be shared of any of these things under discussion? Look, there are rules within ISO that we don't just share it to anyone. I know myself and I know members of the IAM can actually share it back through the members to actually have a view on, but it's not something, because it's a copyrighted artifact. I don't even have a copy of the latest version yet too. Standards Australia is pretty tight down here. I'll be very fortunate to get that. What is the current status of the other standards? Again, you'll see that this week, but pleased to say 11 is pretty close. 55,010, which is finance for non-finance people. Johan and the group did an amazing job on that. And I know, being part of that initial draft, it's really just with ISO at the moment and the editors. For whatever reason, they had a change in editors and that slowed the process down. 55,011, I know Kerry and, oh God, I feel awful now. Tiffany, they've got that and that final stretch. So that should be coming out later this year. And then, of course, 12 and 13. 12 is, of course, people and competency. I've got to say, Rob, who ran that, one of the leaders on that, he ran Calgary University and the asset management fraternity. Dr. Gao from China. There was a nice balance there. I really like that standard because it's not prescriptive, but it does share some insights. And of course, 13, you're going to hear from Shiv in a couple of weeks' time, so I don't want to steal his thunder from his webinar. Wow.
I think that might be it, Martin. You did a phenomenal job there going through those questions. I'll just pick up on the question that somebody asked about the IAM qualifications. So we are going to be updating the IAM qualifications, as I've been saying. It is looking at what's going on with the standards, but also there are other artifacts that have been published over the sort of spring and summer, namely the Global Forum landscape, and we've obviously done some work on the IAM anatomy, and so there are other things to take into account as well. So we are doing work on the exams, and I know other organisations are looking at similar things associated with their own qualifications and their own artifacts as well. So Martin, massive. Well, I'm absolutely amazed how many questions you got through there. That was absolutely brilliant. I wanted to say a massive thank you for going through that information for us. As you can tell, it's been hugely interesting to people who've sort of been engaged. We've got lots of claps and thumbs up and hearts coming in. So so thank you, massive thanks from us at the IM. And just to reiterate, we will be making the recording available, and we will also make Martin's slides available. Martin's very kindly agreed to make the slides available, so we'll make those available together. And we'll pop that in the knowledge library, and we usually put a post out as well just to tell people we've done that. So thank you everyone for joining and for registering. And as Martin said, we've got Boudwin and Tom next week talking about all the standards, so you'll get a sort of an overview, and also some information about how they sort of link together. I think that's their intent.
Yeah,
Yeah, and we are planning on having Shiv Iyer, who Martin identified has been involved in 13, which is a sort of data, and he'll be in September, and I'm hoping that I might be able to secure some of the other people associated with some of the other standards as well, because I think it's just a great opportunity for people to just learn a bit more about what's been going on for all these years to produce these standards. So thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you, Martin. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks, Ursula. Thanks everybody. I really appreciate it. Thanks for your patience. But anyway, all the very best, and I'll get that stuff to you, Ursula, this afternoon or this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.